Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity.
Today, we're finally going to talk about what I think arguably is our favorite role-playing game system.
I think unarguably.
Yeah.
I think it would be tough to belabor the point at this point.
Yeah. And that system is Silcore.
Silhouette Core by DreamPod 9, the system that runs Heavy Gear, Jovian Chronicles, Tribe 8, Gear Krieg, and I think some other things possibly, or at least used to.
Yeah. It was popular
90s. Late 90s. Well, mid to late 90s, early 2000s was its the beginning of its decline, I think. I was just looking at the article on my phone. And basically the wiki article basically says that come 2003 they were basically sort of out of the game of tabletop role-playing games, and they had pretty much diverted completely over to their miniatures lineup for Heavy Gear. Let's take a brief step back to kind of talk about all of Silcore and like kind of the whole milieu of this landscape here. Heavy Gear was one of my very first role-playing games, and I remember specifically getting the book, getting the video game first, actually, at a Barnes & Noble in Milwaukee that doesn't exist anymore. And I got the role-playing game at a I forget what the Arizona alternative of Half Price Books was, but that's the place that I found it. And I was like, oh my gosh, Dad, look, it's Heavy Gear again. And he's like, well, that's cool. But that's where I found this exact book. And it has been well loved and treasured ever since. Now to kind of come at it from the other angle, Heavy Gear as a tabletop role-playing game and as a video game, because it became a video game later on, that happened because some of the guys who I think helped build the MechWarrior games, as translated those from tabletop role-playing games into video games, some of those guys were part of the same crew to build the Heavy Gear franchise, because I think there was some kind of like corporate struggle between the two different companies. Like, I think somebody sold a license, and like somebody was looking for a new license for an alternative to MechWarrior, since they lost the license, and so they wanted to build their own new mech fighting franchise, and that ended up being Heavy Gear, such as it was, which was just spectacularly not as successful as the MechWarrior franchise. So after the early 2000s, it looks like they kind of just focused solely on their tabletop miniatures game, which is sort of where both of those two things came from initially, and kind of gave up on the role-playing game aspect of it.
Okay. But somehow in there created a very interesting and metric and robust role-playing game system. Right.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start talking about this, because that is one of the things, that's one of the core features of it that we really, really like. And I can tell you basically from the game design perspective why it's like that, and how that came, how it evolved into that kind of thing. And the reason is pretty simple. It's because it was designed as a tabletop miniatures game as opposed to a tabletop role-playing game. Basically, when you run miniatures games, especially skirmish games, you need to be able to balance the two sides, even though those two sides have vastly different troop makeups, right?
Okay.
So you might have like one side where it's like this guy wants to have a bunch of aircraft, and the other guy is like, no, I want to have tanks. So you have to have a mechanism, you have to have a mechanical system for the game that allows you to assign value to those two different armies, right? And so I forget how MechWarrior's system worked, but I think theirs was much more of a point-buy kind of thing, whereas Heavy Gears was basically like mecha calculus. It was like, it's like a calculus class for designing objects that can be used in war, right? And that's really, really cool because you can build like anything out of it.
And we've done that.
Yep.
The scope of stuff that you can build is just absolutely ridiculous because we've done everything from like a simple handgun up to a star.
Right.
And it works. It works in the system. You can actually stat out what a star would be like and how much damage it could take. And you can stat out a handgun and it's talking the same numbers.
Right. It's
They're just
the same
ridiculous
language.
numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe that to be a very extrapolated, unintended consequence of the design that they used for the system. Because in Heavy Gear, they actually designed the world to be set up so that there were some pretty impressive like war machines in this world, among which are things like land ships. And some of the rules encompass like using land ships in your tabletop wargaming setup. So they needed to know, like, they needed to build a system that would allow them to build infantry units, mecha units, tanks, aircraft, and then all the way up to, like, battleships.
Right.
And be able to put all those things on the same table. And that, just as an exercise in game design, is impressive, right? And I think they had no idea that it would be so useful to outlandish, crazy science fiction reading tabletop gamers who were like, yeah, let's use this to its maximal possible extent.
Yeah, let's build a starship. Let's build a Dyson sphere. Let's just build a star.
Yeah,
you know,
because it's going to get shot up by the aliens.
Yeah,
who we also built out.
Right.
And we need to know how fast that fight is going to go down. Yeah. So yeah, like kudos absolutely 100% to the DreamPod 9 team for making an awesome role-playing game. It's very much too bad that the role-playing game side of it kind of just fell away in favor of their miniatures lineup, because, like, you know, for the last 15 or 17 years, they just really haven't put out new role-playing game books. It's all been miniatures.
Which is a shame, because I think the role-playing side of it is just as strong, and there's some really interesting, good things that they've done over there as well,
right,
which is another reason that we like it. So from a very high-level view, it sounds really simulationist, and it can be, but there's also some really good stuff worked in there on the individual side of things that actually makes it work really well for a narrativist game as well, and really kind of help you tell the story. So we've had games where we've actually struggled in other systems to do something in the style we want to do it, and we've converted them over to Silcore because that's been the easiest style for us to actually run the game we want to run.
Looking at you, L5R.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, sticking around the core point for the moment, is like, I don't know if they designed their tactical miniatures game first and then tacked on tabletop role-playing game rules, or if they designed both of those things at the same time and it all came in the same package. But the moral of the story is, like, the character rules for tabletop role-playing game, and for the tabletop role-playing game and for the miniatures tactical game, they occur in the same parameter space. Now there's like adjustments that you can make for scale so that you can more easily deal with the numbers and not have to multiply thousands and thousands of things. But they occur in the same parameter space. And there are very few role-playing games where you can talk about, like, we're going to have two guys shooting at each other and then also in that same fight is a tank, and they're all using the same exact rules, right? Usually that kind of thing is like two guys shooting each other is like character rules, and then you switch over to vehicle rules, because it's just not that easy to do. But Silcore did it, and they do it in spades. Like, it is seamless. And maybe part of that is like that they planned for having infantry, and they planned kind of for like having mainish characters like scuttling around and like hopping out of their mechs and like doing stuff. But I kind of feel like they must have just spearheaded it with the intent of having both, of coming at it from both the tactical side and the role-playing side.
And I think it leads to some interesting storytelling possibilities, that you could have one person who takes down a mech.
Absolutely.
Who just is the big damn hero and saves the day.
Right. Yeah, it was never really clear to me, like, what how those two were supposed to interface, because, like, usually the vast majority of the time you get together four or five or six people for a tabletop role-playing game, and they sit around and they play the game together. But with a skirmish game, usually you're talking about one-on-one, like one person on one side versus another person on another side. And it never really clicked to me, I guess, as to how those two things were supposed to overlap, right? How they were supposed to fit together. But we sort of just didn't really care. We just kind of did with it as we will, right? Like, that's the cool thing about it, is like it has transcended being a game into being like the physics of role playing, and that's what I really love about it. It feels that way just in terms of the system, but it also feels that way in terms of like the superpowers of role playing game malleability that it gives you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that we've really taken what we've learned in Silcore, and we use it to compare against a lot of other systems. Whether that's fair or not, up to debate, but it definitely really informs how we look at role playing.
Right. It's kind of our yardstick. It's our gold standard.
Yeah.
When we complain about D&D, a lot of the time those thoughts are couched in how we would handle the thing in Silcore, right? Because we just know that there's a system that would allow us to do this so much more easily, right? Like, when we talk about when we complained in our D&D trilogy about not being able to assign correct values to things, like the value of like the, I don't know, plant growth spell versus the fireball spell. In Silcore, that would be pretty easy, and it would be very obvious that those are not both third level spells or whatever, right? Like, you would be like, okay, one of these is spectacularly more expensive than the other because it just costs more. And that's the kind of thing that we love about Silcore, and why we're a little bit like miffed about that in other systems where it's much harder to assign values. So
we've touched a little bit on what we like about the actual character mechanics, but let's dive into that a little bit more, because I think Silcore does a really interesting thing that gives your characters a lot more depth, in that you can show the difference with a character between what they've learned and like book learning and experience learning, and that's actually structured into how the stats are set up and how the rolls go, which I think is a very like interesting way to set up your character and actually get some role playing right into the mechanics.
Right. So concretely, basically, you've got your attributes, which are similar to your attributes in D&D, like your strength and dexterity, and then you've got your skills, but each skill has both a level and a complexity. And in second edition, like the older version, there were only two levels of complexity. There was simple and complex. And so you had some skills like crafting, or crafting is a bad example. You had some skills that were simple skills that were easy to understand and comprehend. You don't need a PhD in shooting someone to shoot a gun, right? Instead, you had a complex skills were things like sciences and mathematics and electronic combat, electronic warfare, and that kind of thing. But in the newer version, in the actual Silhouette core rules, they expanded that to be like complexity is also a number. And so when you tried to use a skill that had a high complexity for a simple task, you actually got to add a bonus based on your complexity. So if you had a really high complexity in something, you got a lot of book learning about a skill. You might try to do something that's relatively simple and then just really knock it out of the park because you're so knowledgeable about the thing that you get a big bonus to it. So there's a trade-off built in directly to how the skills work, because you're using the same skill points or the same XP points to pay for that. Whether you're going to pay more for the level and thus have more dice to throw at the thing, or pay more into complexity and have like a better knowledge. So it's kind of the experience and practice end versus the theory and academic aspects of the skill, which like is a very interesting angle to put on building your character, because you can build a very similar character that's got like a very high complexity and stuff, and is like very, brainy and like knowledgeable about things, but then has low like practical ability. And then you can have on the opposite end of that somebody who's very experienced but just doesn't really know very much about the deeper parts of the
other thing I want to bring up with Silcore is, so far we've talked about this in the terms of science fiction a lot, and that's really how it was originally set up, is science fiction, heavy gear, mechs, spaceships, things like that, but I don't want people to think that you can't do something fantasy with it, because we certainly have, and it certainly works. You won't necessarily have concrete spells like you do in other systems to say, okay, this is my fireball spell, or this is chill touch or something like that. Instead, you could set it up where you have like a fire skill, or something like that, or you set it up more like a weapon where your firebolt is a weapon. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that, where you can either have something where you're creatively playing jazz as a magician, doing something
soft magic,
or a bit harder magic where you have defined out those as if they were weapons,
right? And
that kind of takes into account for training. Same thing with martial arts styles. The cost of it would really take into account the training time that you may have spent learning that skill. So it is very possible to do something that's a lot softer or harder magic, but just to have magic in there is definitely possible.
Right.
And you can have magic with mechs, so that makes it really flexible, that you can combine fantasy plus science fiction in one thing.
Instant steampunk.
Totally, and match it all together, and it completely works.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely true. We've definitely run a number of different very not science fiction-y games in Silcore. We have kind of a little side world that I guess we call the Yukiverse when we need to refer to it, because we don't really have a real name for it. But that's the progenitor that we built the game Wah from Void Spiral Entertainment around. And that started because we were going to play L5R and we couldn't deal with the rules, so we just rebuilt the thing in heavy gear over a weekend and then started playing it, and then we had a blast. And that's, for anybody who doesn't know what L5R is, it's Legend of the Five Rings. It's a very fantasy, like high fantasy kind of samurai role-playing game, with lots of clans and kind of inter-clan warfare and corruption and stuff. And it's very fascinating, but we couldn't make it work. We just didn't like the system, so we basically rebuilt everything from scratch ourselves, including the lore. Like, eventually we scrapped all that lore too, and ended up with our own stuff completely, and it basically at this point it had no resemblance to L5R at all.
Yeah, I think some of the clan names were the same, and that was about it. Like,
Probably.
That was the only thing that we still retained a little bit in there. But yeah, it was totally the easier thing to do, was just move it over to a completely different system. And now this was the older version of L5R. It's not the most recent one, which I don't think we've looked at yet.
Yeah.
And I've heard good things about it, so that's something we'll have to look into in the future.
But that's an excellent example of, like, we had special powers built out as individual objects in the game. So to clarify, there are different classes of objects in the game rules of Silcore. There are characters, which are one type of thing. There are vehicles, which are a different type of thing. And then there are subsystems, which are a different type of thing. Subsystems can be like an ejection seat, like a thing, like a system inside a vehicle that's separate. But they can also be like weapons or armor or other, utility objects that you would use. And you can use the subsystem rules to build those things for vehicles, but you can also use them to build them for characters. Again, because this is all happening in the same parameter space, all the math is the same.
And it makes it super easy if you want to have a bunch of parts and pieces that you could then pull together into different types of vehicles. So if you want to do something that's themed to say, okay, this is, a war effort somewhere, and we just have a bunch of stuff laying around, how do we slot it all together? You can totally do that and not have to spend as much time like, I'm going to build a tank with this, and I'm going to build a, fighter plane with this. Like, you can share components between the two super easy.
Right. Yeah. The idea being that you don't need to build the tank and the jet out of completely separate parts, that they can share things. They can have some overlap. Like, say they've both got a 40 millimeter cannon on them, right? You just take the 40 millimeter cannon and add it to both objects, to both vehicles, and then boom, it's done. And in heavy gear, that's very apparent because a lot of the vehicles, the idea behind heavy gear is that you've got this sort of Civil War, very, very similar in structure to the American Civil War. And both armies have their own set of mechs, and those mechs they've got hands, right? So they've got interchangeable weapons, and they've got hard points on their backs, so you can kind of take things off and put them on. And so the lore says that these things are modular. So the mechanics also support that modularity, which is really cool. And that modularity then in turn makes it easy to build stuff for your game. Like in D&D, if you were going to build a monster, especially in 5th edition, you really can't translate very much. There's not a lot. I mean, I guess you can say this monster has spells and then rely on the spell rules, but that there's really not a very integral tie between like giving a monster a spell and what the value of that monster is based on the value of the spell. It's just a giant guessing game, right? So in heavy gear, you're like, well, the 40 millimeter cannon has a threat value of 49. If I add it to this jet and to this tank, both of their offensive threat values are going to go up by 49. That's the math, right? Yep. And it's so nice to just be able to know, and to look at it and be like, yes, this thing massively outclasses this other thing. If we put them in a room together, this is going to stomp the other thing. And
we'll talk more about this in a future episode, but because of how modular Silcore is and because of how math heavy Silcore is, it actually lends itself really well to using spreadsheets with it. So years ago, Joe developed an amazing spreadsheet that calculates out a ton of different things for Silcore. And so you can very easily just have a list of all the parts and plunk them into a character sheet and build out whatever you need, which makes it super quick and easy. So, if you're math adverse like I am, do not be scared. There are ways that you can make it a little nicer for yourself to be able to just kind of have something calculate all of that up for you.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. It is math intensive. Like when I said that it's like RPG calculus, it is sort of complicated. Like there's no getting around that part. There are big formulas and complications as to designing things. But I mean, if you're going to just play heavy gear, you don't really need to know any of the design. You just get to play heavy gear, right? I'm driving a hunter, the bad guy's driving a Jaeger, and then we shoot at each other, right? But as a game designer, the idea that there is a system to building stuff and that it makes sense, that really makes me, as a player of the game, feel much more like the designers knew what they were talking about when they said these two things are balanced, as opposed to just like tester fiat assuming, oh yeah, well, we never found any problems with this. Like it's posteriori versus a priori logic, right? Like I want to know for a fact that this is how these two things work. So I get annoyed with that kind of stuff when it's too soft. I like to know exactly what the value of a thing is and why.
And we've also found that, kind of going back to some of the character building stuff here, we've also found that the skills themselves are easy to customize because they're not tied to, a spell, or they're not tied to, specific things like that. It makes it really easy that if you do want to run a different type of a game, you can just create a new skill, so you can swap out, say, small arms for archery, and you can either just kind of paint over the small arms and say this is now archery, or you can actually just completely flip it out for something different, and it works really well because they're not as like intricately tied to everything like the spells or other abilities in the background.
Okay, for transparency, the Silcore system doesn't have things like feats or spells or specific skills that have specific powers. It's a much more kind of generalized type of system. There's like one role mechanic. It's like, pretty clear how the success and failure works. It's global, so it's not like climbing has different rules from shooting kind of thing. Or like in D&D where like a skill check is not the same thing as an attack roll. It's all skill checks in Silcore. So it's one of those kind of more unified type of systems. So that does mean that like you don't need to look up the rules for climbing if you're going to do a climb check. You don't have to look up the rules for diplomacy if you do a diplomacy check. Instead, it's just like, what are the thresholds? Do you roll the thing, right? And they all work the same way. So it is really easy to say, okay, it turns out that we need a psychic power skill. So then now there's a psychic power skill, right? So put some points into that, and then we'll just say that's there, right? Like you don't have to do really anything to skin it, right? You can just kind of paint over it, like Liz said.
One of the other things that we really like from the system actually comes out in combat. And I think this is something we kind of hinted at in some of the D&D episodes, but unlike D&D, where if you get injured, you can just keep going and going and going until you get knocked out, in Silcore, there's a risk to getting injured. Yep. There is a threat to that because you actually start to take penalties the more and more injured you get.
Right.
So your attack is now going to be decreased by a certain amount based on how injured you are, which I think really nicely matches real life. Like if you get shot in the shoulder, you're probably going to not be shooting quite as straight for your next turn. Or if you lose a limb, you're probably not going to be using your two-handed sword anymore, or at least not as, well. So I think that really nicely mirrors up with a kind of a real life perspective. It actually can make your game a little bit grittier, but also really kind of make you think a lot more before you go into combat, especially if it's going to be a very evenly matched combat that you stand a good risk of not getting through this or not getting through it very well.
Right. Or if you're already wounded or damaged or you're in some kind of bad situation, then you're going to be much more averse to starting some shit because you're already at a disadvantage regardless of how much weaker the opponent was to begin with. You're still kind of dinged down a little bit, and it's going to be harder for you to fight to your fullest extent. Another cool part of the mechanics that make them feel very real world is that the primary attributes influence some secondary attributes, and that's how you calculate things like your health and your movement speed, and like the base values that you do for unarmed and armed damage. And those are based on formulas, yet again, that rely on your primary attributes. So, like, there is a bias to certain attributes because, like, health, like your build, your body size, does just make you better as a soldier. It's just really good to have a big, strong soldier, right? Like, now, since in Silcore there is a difference between size, your body size, and your fitness. If you have a really big body-sized guy who's got really low fitness, you've got Private Pile. But, if you've got somebody who's got really low body size and really high fitness, you've got Bruce Lee, right? And those things make actual sense. Like, those are the actual attributes actually showing the way, like, reflecting the way the real world works. None of this, like, is a will save based on wisdom or charisma, kind of like I'm trying to use my mental fortitude here. Is that, am I willing through it with charisma, or am I doing it with wisdom? What does wisdom even mean, right? Like that's those stats don't really reflect the real world, whereas the ones in Silcore do, and they do a pretty good job. So like I said, if you have you want to have soldiers who have high build because it just makes them tougher. That's the way the world works, right? You want to have soldiers that have high fitness because that makes them tougher. That's the way the world works. And so like there is a bias, like you don't like if you're playing a game about soldiers, probably nobody's going to take much of the appearance stat. It's not going to make that much of a difference. Probably, right? Unless you want to make a difference, and like suddenly you're like, okay, well, this is about these guys, this combat squad, and now there's a reporter hanging out with them, and that reporter only wants to talk to the pretty guy. Then that's how the world works, right? Like that accurately reflects the way the life goes. Yeah,
and I think despite the fact that Silcore has a lot of focus on combat, you can easily use it to create a non-combat game. So you do have other attributes in there like appearance that you can, use to create some interesting characters. I think appearance is the one I'm kind of on the fence about the most, because depending on the game I was in, I didn't care about it at all, but sometimes I really did. So it really depended on the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's actually reinforced by the fact that combat in Silcore is less crunchy than it is in D&D. You don't have so many different abilities and powers and special things and like micro rules, minutia, and sub-rolls of sub-rolls of sub-rolls to do, because it's all a unified system. The role that you make to try to convince somebody of something is the same as the role that you would make to try to shoot somebody. So as long as the situations are equally as complex, then the gameplay will be equally as complex. So there is no real bias to like, well, this is heavy on combat, because you don't need to be in those combat situations, and the rules don't necessarily like lean in that direction. You could use the engineering and design rules to build like the finest hotel that anybody's ever been to, or like build a casino or something crazy like that, right? Like, and then that would be about a social game. That's using your engineering chops of Silcore to build a more social game. Now you need not go into that kind of engineering detail in a social game, because maybe it's mostly just politics and there's not a lot of political machinery that needs to be engineered aside from the people themselves. But yeah, it's much easier to have a more equitable kind of content in that game. I'm not going to lie though, I really like running the mechanical nature of the mechanical stuff. And I mean that in both senses, right? Like, I mean, like using the mechanics of the game to run mechs in the game is like a pleasure. It's like silky smooth. It is so good. The other thing that comes in with the way the mechanics treat the characters is that there's also more realism put into the way the roll mechanic handles damage. Because when you shoot at somebody, it's not like they just reduce their hit point pool. There's system shock to take into account, which is like if you take massive damage, you might just be knocked unconscious. There's armor, which actually degrades as it's being used because there are giant holes in it now. And then there's like, you have stamina values that are helping you reduce the amount of damage that you're taking. And then all of that filters down into a health pool that kind of tracks down like hit points, except you only usually have like 5 or 8 of those, right? So there's like multiple layers of your defenses, and then each of those layers is more smaller and less granular than hit points, but total, because you've got a lot of them, is far more granular and specific than the way hit points work. Because as you lose health, you're as Liz said before, you're gaining penalties to your attacks. Now, what's cool about that is they handle accuracy in the game really nicely, because when you attack somebody, how good your attack is against their defense is a multiplier on the damage of the weapon. So if I've got like a pistol that does 5 damage, but I roll a 5 better than on my attack than the guy rolled for his defense, say I roll like 10 and the guy rolls 5, I'm doing 5 times 5 damage. That's 25 damage with a pistol, right? So like that could kill that guy in one shot just because I rolled really, really well. And you think you'd think that that's really unbalanced and swingy, but really it comes out to be very gritty and crunchy and dangerous feeling without actually being that swingy, because you can't really put that much variance in those rolls as you think you can, just because of the way the dice mechanics work. And on top of that, you do have these multiple layers of defense. So like you're going to reduce some armor, you're going to have to get through the guy's stamina and stuff like that. So, but yeah, like it is the mere fact that how well you do on your attack makes a difference feels so much more realistic than like occasionally getting a crit and dealing double damage. You know what I mean? Like that is like a very gimpy kind of way of emulating, of modeling the real world of accuracy being as important as the actual damage of the thing.
Yeah, it really kind of matches like a sniper getting a headshot, like taking the time to prep and plan and then getting that headshot sort of a thing. So, yeah.
And that kind of mechanism is built into the rules. There are ways that you can get bonuses. So like being prone, if you're talking about a sniper trying to take this shot from a long range, he's probably shooting from an extreme range, so he's going to get an extreme range penalty, but he's also shooting prone, so he's going to get a bonus. He might be aiming for a while, which will get him a bonus. He might have a scope, that might get him a bonus. The guy might be unaware and just sitting still, so he's going to get a bonus, right? So like now he's stacking up a huge amount of accuracy, and his one bullet is much more likely to just straight take that guy out. And that again, since it's global, these mechanics apply to basically everything. So you could try to headshot a mech with a different mech's sniper rifle or railgun or whatever. It is so great. And then on the reverse of that, you might have really bad, like poor, low accuracy weapons, like a battle axe or a great axe or something, or like a bazooka, a poorly made bazooka that is like very likely to miss, but will just demolish things when it hits, right? And so there is like that kind of trade-off. It's easier to come up with things that are kind of bruiser-ish, and more difficult and expensive to come up with things that have high accuracy. And again, like all this stuff goes into the way the rules build these systems and subsystems. So there is a bias to say, like, you know, once you get it's more progressively more expensive to have more and more accuracy, right? Or more and more maneuverability. Maneuverability is kind of the reverse of accuracy in the game. The better your maneuverability is, that's kind of reducing the accuracy.
So let's talk about some things we don't like about the system, because we've just gushed a whole bunch about what's so awesome about it. What are some things that we don't like? Well,
it is complicated. It is definitely mathematically intensive, and there's the reason why I built that original spreadsheet was because I kind of needed it. I kind of needed to be able, and again, this is because we were trying to build stuff using the game, not play the game itself. If I were just going to be playing Heavy Gear, I really wouldn't need to do any math at all, aside from building my characters. But I wanted to expand on it, right? So that necessitated an efficient way to build all these things and to apply their big ass formula that you know takes all these different components of a vehicle or a system and precisely fine tunes them into an overall threat value. That did mean that I did need a spreadsheet to do all that math for me.
So I think one thing that I'm always kind of sad with Silcore is it is a D6 game.
Yeah.
And you know, I like to roll a bunch of different dice. So, you know, you do get to roll a lot of D6s, so it's not like you have one die and you're just rolling that one die. But, you know, it is kind of sad that you're not getting that whole panoply of, you know, nice polyhedral dice in there. Yeah,
you don't really get the same dice hoard sensation that you get off of D&D.
Yeah, although we do have one specific set that I love to play Silcore with, that's actually weighted unintentionally because it's got a star design on the 6 side that tends to land up a lot more than down.
Yeah, we should someday do the math on that.
Yeah.
Roll them until we figure out what the average is.
But that's all I can really think of for like downsides, things that I don't like is, yes, it is pretty math heavy, and it's just six-sided dice.
I mean, I can think of, I guess, a couple of other things. There are rules minutia components in Silcore. It's not like it's completely crunch free. It's not free of edge cases, right? And so there are a bunch of edge cases for Heavy Gear. There's a bunch of edge cases for Jovian Chronicles. There's a bunch of edge cases in the Silcore core book. And those are things like dealing with radiation and like diseases and stuff like that. And like sometimes there'll be like for example, there will be rules for changing the speed of something because it's moving through water, like walkers, like mech walkers. Walking mechs with legs can't move so quick through water because it's like heavy and stuff, right? And so there are edge cases built into the game, and sometimes, I think frequently when we were playing it, especially when we've modded it heavily for one of our own games, we generally tend to forget about a lot of that stuff. So we're kind of playing like Silcore light almost. And that might contraindicate the complexity of the rules, just because at a certain point we're kind of hand waving a lot of stuff that might be in somebody else's game might be very important stuff. But I think most of the time when we were dealing with stuff like this, we would zoom out. We like to zoom in and zoom out. So we pay more attention to the rules and the rules minutia when it's really, really important. And then when it's not that important, we just zoom out. We say, okay, well, it doesn't really matter how much water is between you and the other thing, because you're going to be driving for a week. You know, it's like you're going to drive around a lot of water. You're going to drive through some of the water. It's going to even out in the end, right? Yeah. So we tend to, I think, abstract away detail that we don't care about in favor of a more interesting and more active game.
Yeah, and it works without that detail, which I think is something else that kind of, you know, there are some systems that you could try to abstract out some of that stuff and it's just not going to work.
Right.
But it works without that stuff pretty well. I think the other thing that I have from the do not like side of it is it's not very well known.
That's true.
There aren't many people out there who've seen Silcore before, who know about it, who've experienced it. So the downside is that makes it much more difficult to find a group of players.
Right.
So I don't think we've ever ran a game where it hasn't just been the two of us.
Well, I used to run Silcore in college.
Okay.
And that would have been 2008 at latest, right?
Yeah.
So it would have been 2003 to 2008. I think that was already after the decline of their role-playing game stuff. So yeah, like we never. I only ran a handful of Silcore games for other people for those groups, but that was like 12 or 15 other players that I had cajoled into playing it. But yeah, at this point, basically, it's unheard of. Like. I mean, to be honest, like the books are probably 17 years out of date at this point. So the fact that nobody is like playing second edition these days almost, you know?
Yeah. I remember seeing one Twitter thread at one point of like, what's your favorite games? And I scrolled through to specifically see if I could find somebody. And there was one person who mentioned Silcore on this huge thread.
Are you sure it wasn't me?
It was not you. It was somebody else. And I remember bringing it to you and being like, oh my gosh, there's somebody else in the world who actually knows what Silcore is. That's awesome. That's not to say that wasn't somebody that we know and have exposed to it. That I just didn't know their Twitter handle. But, you know, I thought it was kind of interesting that it was just one out of this huge group. And I had to spend quite a long time, you know, scrolling through all the replies to find that.
Yeah, that is kind of a crying shame. As a side note, I did actually talk to like the head of the company at one point via email. I was curious. I think this was probably back in college when I was thinking about writing a role-playing game using Silcore, and I actually just emailed DreamPod9 and said like, "Hey, I'm thinking about writing a game using this system. What would that entail?" And they were basically like, "Hey man, we don't care, go for it, just as long as somebody has to buy our book to play your game, fair game, go for it." And I think the problem with that was like it's so globally unified that it would be really hard to do that. Actually, like it would be very easy to just write a game that shows how to play the game, and for people to not have to go buy a Silcore or a Heavy Gear book. But I mean, that was probably more than a decade ago.
Yeah. Speaking of the book, I think we need to give an ode to our poor Silcore book. So we're actually looking at it here as we're recording this. And at one point, it had a soft cover, just like our Heavy Gear and our Jovian Chronicle book. It was a softbound book, but we used it so much that its binding broke and its covers fell off. And so at one point, this is probably like 10 years ago, we took it into a Staples or an Office Depot or someplace like that and had them spiral bound the thing and just put a plain blue cover on it, which is now coming off as well.
Totally detached.
Completely. The front cover's almost totally off. Back cover, or rather, the front cover is totally off. Back cover's almost there. We've loved this book so much and abused it so much that it's just falling apart even after we tried to repair it and fix it and keep it going.
Right. I feel like at this point we almost need to like build one of those leather bound Bible, like metal cornered, like loose leaf things for the poor old thing.
And put it in a glass display case. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's loose leaf enough now. We could probably just scan every page.
Yeah,
well, maybe we could get a PDF version of it on
Drive-through RPG or some other source. Yeah.
Now, I guess let's wrap up with like the current state of the thing, because we haven't really looked into it for years now, because we haven't been playing it lately, and also because like nothing seemed to have been happening with it. But it turns out that obviously they did the first Heavy Gear game. They did Heavy Gear 2. Those are good games. I played the crap out of those, but after that they like had like a animated TV show for a bit. They went into a new miniatures game, which I think I actually have a book for, but it turns out that they've actually rebuilt their miniatures game a couple of times, as recently as like 2015 and 2018. So they have a new Jovian Chronicles thing that I think they call Jovian Wars. So maybe we should look into it again and kind of find out what the current state of things is there, and see if there's more, if Silcore is still alive, or if they've completely cut that loose and just stuck with their miniatures gaming.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where they're at, where DreamPod 9 is at with everything.
I mean, they still exist. I hope they continue to exist for a long time, because I need to get a new Silcore book, obviously.
Right, yeah. Write them and be like, hey, do you happen to have any of these in the storeroom? Send pictures of our poor abused copy.
Right.
We need a new one.
Yeah. I'll give you $60 for it. I mean, or unless it's more than that, in which case I'll give you 120.
Well, thank you for listening to us gush about Silcore. We totally just fangirled there for I don't know how long, but it was completely worth it.
Squee!
Yay! It was great. So we'll talk to you again later about other things like spreadsheets and other fun stuff like that.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table signing off. See you next time, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Peace. This poor book. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's all like, it's all got, and the Heavy Gear book has this too, but it's all like yellowed from finger grease and stuff on the edges and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Poor thing. It feels really, really bad to like accidentally pull the cover off and for it to just float free. Oh, poor book.
Gosh, yeah, this one, Jovian Chronicles, looks so much like nicer in comparison, but like I do feel like there's a paper difference potentially. Yeah, it's a thinner, different feel to the paper.
Makes it feel more science fiction-y.
Yeah.
It's a good game. Everybody should play it.